CDR30 Pavilion, the first ever carbon removals pavilion, which I have now said about 20 times on stage this week, and I will be saying mercilessly for the rest of the 2 weeks. It's very, very exciting for us to be here at COP as the CDR community. CDR is a community initiative for universities and the full streets to learn about carbon removal in depth, and we hope to experiment next year and to make it a regular fixture at COPs in the future. I'm the Secretary General of the Negative Emissions Platform, which is the Brussels-based industry association for the carbon removal industry, focused mainly on policy advocacy, and most of that in Europe, but also doing other things to support the sector. And I'm the moderator for today's session, which is about financing for carbon removals, particularly in the context of Article 6. Something which I know not enough about, and I'm always keen to learn from, thank you Beatrice, I need to hold this closer. I'm keen to learn from Angie Johnston, who's our ultimate expert on Article 6, and she's going to start off by giving us a presentation on Article 6, what it is and why we should care. So Angie, maybe you can introduce yourself and start your presentation.
Testing. Well, Chris, and again, I think it's crazy that this is the first time we've had a pavilion that addresses the net zero, but anyway, thanks to your efforts we have. So I'll then present. My name's Angie Johnston. I'm a research fellow at the University of and really focused on that intersection that brings them all together, whether it's voluntary and compliance, which is the emerging Article 6 carbon market framework under the Paris Agreement. So I have a bit of a presentation to be able to level session today. So the first big question is, what is Article 6? And I find it, you can see it in front of us. Parties recognize that some parties choose to pursue voluntary cooperation in the implementation of their nationally determined contributions to allow for higher ambition in their mitigation and to promote sustainable development and environmental integrity. Now, to those who have tracked international carbon markets, including under the Kyoto Protocol, there are some new elements baked into this provision of Article 6 that have led to some really interesting new developments. So these being sustainable development, the focus on higher ambition, so not only a mechanism that offsets one-to-one, but how do we actually use market mechanisms to increase ambition, and a very fundamental one, which is environmental integrity. So the combination of these Article 6, there's three key provisions that are part of that, so we'll walk through them just briefly here. We have Article 6.2. Now this governs cooperative approaches between countries. Now, if you remember back to the Kyoto Protocol days, there was emissions trading between annexed nations. This is in effect the same thing. So this is a mechanism through which countries can purchase or sell internationally traded mitigation outcomes. Now, Article 6.2 is the only route that you can get an ITMO, and that becomes really critical for when we start talking about how to access international markets, such as CORSIA, which require corresponding adjustments.
What's the name? Oh, sorry.
It's the internationally traded mitigation outcome. Yeah, so yeah, thank you for the intro. Next, we have Article 6.4. So those of you familiar with the Clean Development Mechanism, this is the home of the new Paris Agreement crediting mechanism. Now, this corollary between the two is really in terms of projects being able to carry over into the new system, but there's also a new suite of projects that have already issued notice that they'll be developed under that mechanism. We'll dive into the pipelines a little bit later in the presentation. So we've got two trading-based frameworks, but we also have Article 6.8, which is non-market approaches. And in theory, this covers everything that doesn't result in a internationally traded mitigation outcome or mitigation contribution unit under Article 6.4. But within this broad suite, different topics have been proposed, including in the rooms here at this top, topics such as sustainable tourism and discussions related to restoration and other different kinds of activities. So we really have a full suite of activities within the broad Article 6 framework. And so whenever we hear Article 6 talked about broadly, it's really important to understand which of these buckets are we referring to specifically and what does that mean. So, before we jump deep into the Article 6 pipeline, it's worth actually just contextualizing where does Article 6 sit within the overall ecosystem. And what's really powerful about an international linking mechanism like Article 6 is that it sits at the heart of the carbon market ecosystem. So it's something that can link voluntary demand, the voluntary carbon market, it can link compliance demand and compliance, and it also between, say, in the framework and additional Paris Agreement. There's a lot of interaction. And what's really critical also, and kind of a point of misunderstanding often, is that there are two different types of units that can often be traded within the carbon market. So you have the project-based credit market, which often represents 1 ton of CO2 avoided, reduced, or removed. And you also have the allowance-based market. So those familiar with the EU ETS and different forms of allowances. Now what's interesting, a critical factor that brings all these pieces together is that there's a fungibility between the project-based market and the allowance market. This happens to different degrees in different jurisdictions. In the EU, they allowed clean development units in and then removed them later on due to environmental integrity concerns. The point is that this is an interlinked system. And so when you look at the rules of Article 6, that's why it really matters to get them right for international trade. And so as I said, the rules concerning how we might generate the international mitigation outcome really does matter. And so hallmarks such as a corresponding adjustment, which we'll discuss on today's panel, really do matter. And before we dive in, a corresponding adjustment where one country adjusts their emission balance in order to export a unit over to the buyer country. So again, very similar when we used to have the Kyoto Protocol, different regime, because one thing that makes carbon trading so much more complex under the Paris Agreement than the Kyoto Protocol is that countries have a nationally determined contribution, and it's that contribution that sets the baseline to measure ambition from. It's much more complex than a fixed target and a top-down kind of mechanism like we had with the Kyoto Protocol. Now, while it makes it more, it also means there's rich opportunity here, and so I hope we'll speak on the panel today about some of. So there's a number of opportunities for carbon dioxide removal within this suite. So we've got the ability to access the growing market for higher integrity units. So as I said, the shift to the Paris was a real signal for integrity across the board. What we know from carbon credit rating agencies is that removal, particularly technological removals, score the highest in terms of their validity ratings. And so that is a positive signal for CDR. It also encourages inventory visibility on the part of countries. So what do I mean by this? Well, it's interesting because even 5 years ago we didn't have half the beautiful technologies to the state that we have all around the room in play in the world. And what the inventory under the Paris Agreement can also take a long time to catch up by the IPCC. The ability of it for countries, and indeed helps encourage them to actually start find that as part of their NDC. Next, they tend to be projects higher on the MAC curve. So in terms of there's concerns about greenwashing and mitigation deterrence, removal isn't as affected by that, because if someone has a choice between paying several $100 for a carbon credit versus station, they're going to be a cheaper one. Here is that there's much less risk of. One thing that's really important, the Paris Agreement runs the full tree, and we into sources, so to reach the state of net zero, but actually we need even beyond reaching net zero. We know we're in a state of overshoot now, and carbon removal is the only thing that can pull us back from that. And we also can see there's a real opportunity for CDR again to plug into the international aviation offsetting schemes such as CORSIA, which will only again be needed more and more in the future given the growth of emissions in the industry. So how are in practice today? Under Article 6.2 it was agreed back at COP26 after the negotiation on from the Paris Agreement. Since we had 102 memorandums of understanding, so these are agreements between countries that set the terms of engagement for Article 6 discussions. We have 11 buyer countries, 54 potential host countries, and we have, sadly, no carbon removal projects listed. Now this will change because we have seen just this year, just a few months ago, the first Article 6.2 deal on durable CDR being inked between Switzerland and Norway. However, in comparison to other forms of emission reduction project, there's a lot of catch-up to play under Article 6.2. But there's some advantages for trade under Article 6.2 for CDR, as well unpack in the next slide, because it does require the same 2% cancel for overall mitigation, the 5% contribution to the adaptation fund, as 6.4 required. Then, in terms of Article 6.4, the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism, the rules for this, the overarching rules, the RMPs were agreed at COP26, but kind of final key pieces of the rulebook needed for operationalization were concluded last year at COP29 in Belém. We've also seen a bunch of activity under this mechanism. We've seen 114 countries set up designated national authorities. This is key for enabling trade domestically and internationally. As I mentioned, the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism is going to see significant transition from the Clean Development Mechanism. Indeed, we've seen 2,462 requests from CDM developers to transition. There's a little bit of to apply for those activities that are trying to use system. And it's interesting to note that it was a very different framework because under it we had no avoidance credits that was labeled as adaptation, and in terms of nature we had forestation, reforestation activities, but those could only issue temporary CERMs. So this new system under the PACM is very different in that regard in terms of it allows everything in and makes everything into an internationally traded mitigation outcome as long as it meets the standards and criteria under the 6.4 framework. Next, in terms of the project pipeline, so what new interest in utilizing as part of their we know that yet only 4 which we covered the CDR report last year and covering it in we can see there's a between international crediting mechanisms and the voluntary power have begun to shift. So why is this disjunct apparent? So there's a number of different areas, and again this is getting quite complex and into the weeds of it, but it's interesting to know because corresponding adjustments are agnostic as to inventory visibility. So it doesn't matter if the country is already counting that unit, it's going to allow the export of it through the corresponding adjustment. It has to add a plus to its adjusted emissions inventory in order to allow that buyer country to claim a minus. And that's true whether it's a buyer country or indeed a buying corporate such as CORSIA who require a correspondingly adjusted credit. As I mentioned, unlike the Kyoto Protocol where RED Plus was labeled as adaptation, now all forms of removals and avoidance by to the mechanism. And so this can cause for CDR because we know that there's a very point involved in these different CDR, that it was at least 3 times more for compared to other forms of avoidance carbon credits. The difference becomes 100 when you look at the newer forms of kind of weak proposition that particularly the kinds of and the negative platform work on different price points can implications also for some of the function limitation and the 2% cancellation for overall mitigation. In effect, if you have to spend 7% on every transaction towards those different things, it matters if you're trying to transact a higher value transaction compared to a lower value one. And so in real terms, it can cost more to transact CDR under Article 6. And there's also some interesting implications to some of the novel methods to the PACM, including the need for a downward adjustment. We know, if, a technology such as it's really challenging if you're then having to force a downward baseline year on year, because simply these technologies function very differently to other forms of carbon project out there. So apologies for getting on this. I'm very happy with anyone in the room that wants to discuss more. But we also offer some resources to dive into some of these issues a little bit deeper. So we have the Oxford Principles for Responsible Use of Article 6, which distinguish between offsetting and mutual purposes. We have a policy brief on a net zero aligned packet that we released in June. We have a working paper that examines neutralization outcomes in the era of Article 6. And finally, just last a roadmap to net zero aligned carbon market regulation, really tying it together with governments. What do all these pieces of the Article 6 puzzle look like in context with their voluntary and compliance market pieces? So with that introduction, I'll pass that over to Chris. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm not going to clap because I'm holding it. Thanks for that. And as usual, super informative. I guess we're not using this anymore, right? So I'll just go back to the kind of title slide. So we have. Okay. Yeah. So thanks very much for that, and now we'll dive into the discussion. And maybe start with you, Eugene. So. What are the amendments and actions that are going to make durable CDR feasible in this kind of new world? It sounds like you have quite a few challenges, and what are the solutions what are the solutions to those challenges?
From understanding and connecting back to climate science. So we know fundamentally, even in the atmosphere, there's a difference between avoidance, removal, and then carbon removal. So I think one of the key things really unless possible and equally scale, not moving the needle on climate. This is again one of these distinctions between the journey towards net zero and even once we've reached net zero, possible available, that we will continue to need these types of technologies into the future. And so in terms of longevity of the industry, that's a really key piece to understand. So I think in terms of moving the needle, rather than a system such as Article 6 which tries to homogenize all forms of units and as one mitigation outcome, we do need some distinction. And we see that distinction in the voluntary carbon market as entities are curating higher and higher integrity portfolios, that we see a real mix of credit position to remove as well within that industry. That's not to say that avoidance and reduction projects don't have a place. In fact, under the Paris Agreement, they have many different places. And so part of the puzzle is also utilizing Article 5 to finance results-based future projects, Article 9 to finance all waste reduction, future-based activities, and really leaving Article 6 for some of the harder to reach stuff as it was designed to do in terms of raising ambition. That also makes it actually easier to transact within the framework of Article 6. We've seen some of the first trades controversy that because these processes take a lot of time, actually it's more efficient to utilize all of the levers of the Paris Agreement for their intended output. So that's where to start from, but yeah.
And so I'm going to ask you and Andrea to comment on this sort of follow-up question. So you talked about the fact that there are higher and higher kind of quality standards being set by some of the voluntary markets, making I've also heard here at COP this week others talking about the voluntary carbon market being a race to the bottom. So, are you really confident that the voluntary carbon market is capable of increasing quality rather than decreasing it?
And it depends on what type of project we're talking about and what type of life we're seeing. But we'll also shift towards points correlate to that as well. Understanding is that the price and that a carbon credit doesn't matter whatever type of project it comes from, because buyers are also increasingly aware that if they're paying those low price points, they're also likely not getting a compliance fee in a pure labor market. And so we see this market of removals and particularly long-term offtake within that framework as being signaled doing the right thing on the market.
Yeah, so Andrea, when you respond to that question, introduce yourselves and explain you do as well. Like this with the
Okay. Yes, thank you so much for the invitation. My name is Leo. I represent the education companies. We've been founded in 2009, and since then we promote the world of carbon market distribution trading systems, voluntary market, also international mechanisms such as CDR30 and now Article 6. All it's really strange. Can you hear me? Okay. So some commenting on question on the visa. I think we need to be very clear with the use of voluntary carbon market, what it means. And I think we in a very interesting. First, there's demand, so that voluntary decide to purchase carbon because they have some voluntary targets for whatever reasons, and so that's voluntary demand. But then we use the term to in ecosystem project that then increasingly are not only for voluntary purposes, but also through mechanism of Article 6.2, they use for compliance. International gain is mentioned by NG. Singapore has a carbon tax and offsets on what we use to carbon market. You said it's a bottom. I really don't think to comment what the ICT organization have done increase of supply. Also, if you look at companies that are doing carbon market, they're not cheapest credits. There are some of the largest players in the voluntary market that they're buying removals only, and in some cases high removals because value and environment. I think there would be greater interplay between the voluntary carbon market ecosystem and compliance mechanism. I think that's a good thing. But I also think there will always be some demand that is voluntary, that is pre-compliance, or perhaps for companies that are based in countries where compliance markets are not on the agenda for the foreseeable future. ECM, I'll comment. Does this work? I'm the for continuous improvement work programs at the Integrity Council for the voluntary carbon markets. But I mean, I think what we do at it. We are an independent governance body for that segment. Programs, that is the word we use. So these are programs that generate carbon credits. The administrative bodies, government, basically the area that we cut up. And what we do is we assess these programs against an assessment framework that we have with about 250 methodologies to make all the credit we accept eligible for probably you mean just credit for not looking at that. Partially what we're doing, making sure that the bottom is trustworthy. I mean, you can do with the credit, or you can use it, but for it has to be good. I mean, preferably all wallets or whatever, a certain threshold. Above that, there's always appreciation paragraph. We are agnostic. We don't tech-based nature. We are in the all tools and the toolkit. So, yeah. And I think there has really been progress. Programs have been evolving. They've been developing new, better standards themselves. They react to demand signals, especially those that Inge mentioned that Andrea confirmed. There are basically buyers are saying we are only going to buy credits above a particular threshold quality. So they're looking at CORSI eligibility, for example. They're looking at CCP eligibility. They are trying to build a portfolio, maybe only removals or at least a part of removals we have required. Market that's ready to evolve. Granted, it's not an easy thing to do. But there is, in a sense, 35 methodologies. And the credits issued the approved methodology is just 4% of the backward-looking part of the market, right? That was already been issued. So arguably not a very large portion right now. But a lot of the methodologies that we have approved currently have no issues. That is because those are methodologies. The new methodology in many cases pass our assessments. And hopefully this will give us a looking of our credits. And I mean, it's all, I'll talk about Article 6 further. I'm also a former Article 6 manager. I was close in the role of Glasgow, and this gives me fond memory.
I think we can discuss those here later. I'm very curious. So maybe I can a little deeper on the mechanism. So, and perhaps Inge, you can start us off. Who authorized these Article 6 credits? Understanding in 6.2, basically just up to the concern. But who Article 6? What's the process to take? Is it transparent? How easy for operators of carbon removal activities to actually work with that mechanism?
I'm happy to take that question. So, in the Article 6 jargon, there's the authorisation done by the. So, to turn a mitigation into an ITMO, an internationally transferred mitigation, always needs positive decision of host country, and that allows for the credits, the reductions and removals towards target of the buying country. And by authorizing, the country commits to a corresponding adjustment, as explained by Peter before, that is the subtraction of those volumes from the carbon balance of host country. The difference between 6.2 and 6.4 is that the methodology leading to the calculation of these mitigation outcomes, these reduction of removals, are up to the countries participating in the cooperative approach, whereas 6.4 is a centralized crediting mechanism housed within the UNFCCC. So there is a supervisory body with some expert panels support unit that meet regularly and approve the rules of operation of the mechanism and the methodologies. So for now, we had only one approved methodology. It's a reduction or avoidance methodology around landfill gases. But we do have a series of standards that sets the basic rules around baseline setting, additionality, permanence, addressing leakage, and the rules set by supervisory body are stringent, quite rigid, which is way a good thing. It means that the units present reductions and removals higher, an amount of reduction and removal that is higher than what is credited, but there are critical elements that make the development challenging. And I think removals, I think it was in the presentation for downward the baseline is something being raised as potentially pro, but there are also to from that adjustment. I don't want to details because I might get some details wrong. Basically, for the purpose of a project developer, an off-taker, an investor, there's two routes. There's the 6.4 mechanism, where most of the details are set by, are approved by a supervisory board, whereas under 6.2, the rules are negotiated by that is involved in that specific.
Okay, so if I look to the credits for the project that I'm doing onto that kind of article market, I need to make sure, first of all, that the country in which I'm operating approves that, and so that could be done. I mean, it depends on the country, so it could be a really easy process or a complicated process. And then once I have that nice approval, I can go to 6 supervisory body and submit approved by my company. Can you then run this through an approved methodology for the project?
The two things happen in parallel. It's usually first there's a the supervisory, the host country, and methodology, carbon removal. So it is possible step for the carbon removal could be develop a methodology that is compliant with the package 6.4 step.
Backlog to get approved by this. But what's important, I think, is very important that signals that as a developer you've considered the benefits, and that's the first step, because what is that like you go and develop a project and then try and backlog solve it into it. So that's the first thing. That's why we've seen biochar register, we've seen projects register, even approved methodologies. Got one methodology approved. So you can see the pipeline, this gap.
I remember seeing some analysis that suggested that these would be submitted on a project-by-project basis. Or is that not the case? Because it sounded to me like when I first heard about it that you would, a biochar project in operator would have to have a separate approval for a project for another one.
Sorry. Why? Yeah, I think it you need to kind of rally around it forward just at the same time, because say if you had a very bespoke methodology forward that did only work in one context, you could do that, but that wouldn't be like
I think what you mean is that obviously as a program like space, everybody would approve the registration, all issuances, adherence to the standard, the which you not authorize a 6-4 credit using for other purposes that are seen. But the methodology obviously is for all projects using that methodology. But as any other program, the SBN, the supervisory body, will verify how the methodology is applied.
Okay. Anton, how compatible your body of work already produced, the standards you've already created, with what you I know it's very limited. You talked about how limited the product from whatever 6.4 is so far, and how confident are you existing standards like yours to be comes out of our?
Well, I mean, we see that we're doing the Interior Council carbon credit policy and Article 6 are in the same business of ensuring that there are high quality carbon credits available to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. Right? We just recently published a report from a continuous improvement program, and it's our efforts to our rules and see what we need to, how the market needs to adapt. So we focus specifically on Paris alignment, and we talk adjustments, we talk about the baselines and all those things. I mean, as AGN and the said to the world, the independent carbon credits programs are a player, right? They're one of the underlying mechanisms, as I think that's the term used in the last year's decision, that can issue credits that, when authorized by most countries, become internationally transferred mitigation funds. So, and then sometimes colloquially, which I shouldn't have said that. That's an imprecise term that we should try to maybe limit the use of. And 6.4 operates as a carbon credit program in our language, so it's a mechanism, as independent mechanism or domestic mechanism, for example. And it has the same structure. There's an administrative body, there's a set of standards, set of tools, a registry, a project, issue credit, all the same. But obviously, because the Paris Agreement rating mechanism is centralized and governed, it's widely expected to be on a standard, a new kind of mechanism that considers all of the lessons learned. In this sense, we're doing the same work. Obviously, there are always users, countries, product developers will have reasons, buyers will have reasons for going to this or that segment of the market, and there's going to be variety there. And what we are the mechanisms that we're trying to make our rules into ways of achieving the same level of integrity. That is a complicated task. But we do many of this similar works. We also prove method of issues for different types of works of different I'd find in how we living analysis baseline setting. There are ways of, right, and both of us are looking for better ways to do it.
Okay, and I'm not sure if this is a controversial question or not, so maybe tell me, but are you, so when you look at giving your ICBCM seal of approval to something, are you going to be regarded an Article 6.4 methodology approval given? So in other words, are you going to be taking good enough for them that really helps in making sure it's good for us? Or are we looking at the other way around? Are they looking at your standard? It's good enough for us, that helps in achieving is it good enough for us that the UHC? So higher standard.
I don't think controversial question. I mean, I think there has been this cross-pollination. We interact regularly with the supervisory body and the methodological panel I mean, many of the sources of insights, the science, the research that is the same, right? And we're looking at what the bank was doing, and they publish decisions and methodologies. We publish something we call board of, and it's a little bit more meat for the market to chew on and look at. That's not very kind of rock analogy. More algae, and we can reference the work going on, especially in the technical day by day, right? There are a lot of folks working on methodological approach. So we often, there's more work going on in the back. Please follow that. And, consider what's going 6.4. Talk about permanence. There's so much in there. There's so much to talk about. There's the novel compensation mechanisms, the conversation about liability, monitoring periods. All that is informing our work through the continuous improvement work programs, and it's a close relationship. But because this space, especially in moving so fast, new developments literally every month, new evidence every month. So I think we're sort of moving staggeringly, but hopefully forward.
Okay, and then Andrea, from the point of view of your members, is the interplay between existing 6.0? How do you see that from the members' point of view?
Is just, of course, is fragmentation is excessive. It can benefit having flexibility for competition between different programs, then eventually the governments. The host country that will authorize, and the governments in the buying country that will decide what credit towards the climate target. For example, there will be a decision whether to accept carbon only, maybe a subset of carbon credits, rely on some of the existing credit mechanisms that are out there, or perhaps even come up with new EU-led credit mechanisms. So it's these are government decisions. We want to avoid excessive complexity and fragmentation. When I say we, our members, companies active in the market, but we accept that.
Maybe Inji, so climate scientist, a researcher, an expert of this area, about how this landscape, maybe from a sort of climate integrity perspective, or from
Because again, when the negotiations with the CDM were well underway, we saw a better connection to climate science. We saw this understanding of different types of projects manifest different types of that then play out differently including in terms of how we might connect the market. Because I think what's quite interesting, and coming back to that earlier diagram that I presented, Article 6 can provide the link between voluntary and compliance markets, both internationally, but even the EU ETS and the UK ETS, both to integrate rules within their frameworks. Article 6 could be the exchange mechanism through which that flow across borders. And so that is a powerful future potential for the mechanism. We need to make sure that the mechanism at best is truly unit agnostic. And this is where the different price points can really have some big impacts, because as I mentioned under 6.4, you do have in essence 7% of every transaction that has to, that doesn't effectuate into your terms of the credits. And so we already also know that a lot of those kind of projects are already running on razor thin margins, because they're large industrial projects. They have to be very transparent and open about their operating costs. And so one of the other kind of key parts of this is not only the part of actually unpick this myth that you require a correspondent all the time in order to some of these do require and private financing, and that's not something that we need to and should ignore. And it's something that I think is a reality, because again, we're funding very different types of projects, so we need to ensure that the financing can best and most efficiently connect back to those without having a barrier to entry like that. Because right now, it's a lot easier to correspondingly adjust units that you're already counting on your NDCs, or units that are just lower cost, because it's a lot harder to get a government to agree to that. Otherwise, it's not been much of a problem yet, because we're still transacting at relatively low levels and doing pilot tests, but it could be an issue at scale. And again, because we need to think about the Paris Agreement in phases, this phase towards net zero, but also beyond and towards a net negative state in order to pull us back from that state of overshoot. And that became really clear. We had the first overshoot conference ever in October this last month in Vienna, and it was increasingly clear that the actual, climate scientists doing this modeling, really convey that this need to, again, ensure we have separate targets between reductions and removals. And I think that logic needs to also flow back to how we treat market mechanisms. Again, market mechanisms being one of the tools in the toolbox to finance the full suite of projects that we know we need to reach net zero.
Thank you. In one way, you could look at this 7% story and say, actually, there's an incentive to stay domestic and not engage in these international trade mechanisms. If you're a project developer, you might be better off sticking with providing selling your credits domestically rather than going abroad, right? Or am I wrong about that? How's that? Are you seeing that? Does that make sense?
The 7% is 6-4 requirement. So it's only compatible with the balance review mechanism of Europe. Well, other mechanisms may have other things, but
Right. So if you're saying, like, if you're a German developer and you develop in Germany, you sell to a German company, and there's no 6.4 involved, then you don't have to.
it doesn't have to do with the whether it's transacted or not. It has to do whether you're using the balance review mechanism or not. So if you're using an independent program or domestic program and selling internationally through 6.2, then, well, if that mechanism you're using, the crediting mechanism, does not envision a similar share of proceeds and overall mitigation of global emissions contribution, then you won't have to do it.
So what I'm getting at is that we may emerge into a world where if the 7% remains a kind of hard rule and that flexibility ends up being quite limited, there may be a certain type of project developer or a certain type of carbon removal product which kind of makes sense in an Article 6.4 world, and other types which don't, and therefore we may see some kind of divergence or separation in the market into different streams. Is that?
Yeah, I think, again, we have to realize that this mechanism has been negotiated for 10 years, and 10 years ago we didn't have this kind of novel CDR really anywhere at scale. So there thankfully is an opportunity for kind of rule revisiting, if not revision, in 2028, and I think this is one of those areas that will have some experience of how this is played out in practice, and there should be room to calibrate the rules. What's interesting again is because this tension between saying where the mechanism is pathway agnostic between avoidance, reduction, removals, I think we do need to start seeing some nuance there, because otherwise, again, these are very different types of projects to finance on the ground, and so if we're really thinking about it as a financing mechanism, we need to ensure that it's fit for practice to that end.
The mechanism, I fully agree with what you just said, the mechanism is activity agnostic. The unit is a unit. Then, as I said before, then it's up to governments to decide how to use this. So, even without changing the rules of the mechanism, I can see very easily a situation, hypothetically, where a government will only accept carbon removal credits and not avoidance of reductions towards a certain target that they would have, or we use as credits in the EU and UK ETS. So there are already opportunities to differentiate and prioritize certain activities, certain high-cost, high-impact activities, also within the current set of rules. Then we'll see in 2028 what the review will bring.
Okay, yeah, and I guess it's, as you say, it's a moving target. It's being negotiated, and I'm sure it'll be refined and So let me turn then to the question of this is dead attack.
So one of the credits that the JEP can mitigation outcome, which can be correspondingly adjusted. Now, the need for corresponding adjustments came up because of the nature of the Paris Agreement having all parties have an NDC. Everyone we work by, as I was mentioned, to identify units, and actually we've actually had the first few reports this year that have come through that have looked at that process, but it's still a highly manual process right now, and we've seen some inconsistencies in how these are reported, and I think it's important to kind of unpack, and I think this comes up time and again, the distinction between country and international inventories and targets and corporate ones, and I think this is really critical for particularly technological. I think it's important to have a kind of mature conversation about, viewing these projects as neutralization outcomes in a different manner and not necessarily having to have that corresponding adjustment in order to, say, use it with Corsair or whatnot. But I think some ways in terms of that.
Is a claim, a contribution claim, something which is valuable? How much interest do you have?
Claims, unfortunately, there is limited interest in current corporate or carbon community. There have been some attempts by companies, marketing companies, including some beta members, but what I was saying, criminalization of certain companies, what were seen as misleading claims around products, around the corporate targets and the climate impact of the operations. So if you really want to maintain and scale a vibrant voluntary carbon, goes beyond voluntary carbon market. I think so far is not seen as strong enough, not seen as valuable enough.
It kind of gets you out of the need to. It gets you out of the whole double counting problem, right?
That's why I think we need to distinguish between neutralization claims, which are a specific type of claim using a specific unit, so that's kind of like for like offsetting, if you will, but compared to just general offsetting claims, and we distinguish between that in the principles for Article 6 responsible engagement.
Okay, and from your point of view, do you think there are extra protections needed against double counting, or are you confident that the Article 6.4 and Article 6.2, the Article 6 system in general is robust?
Well, I mean, there are a lot of things under the double counting umbrella. I mean, but we're more from our side, from the credit equality side, before you sort of think of this used or transacted. There are other double counting issues that matter, double registration, double issuance, sort of intra-mechanism level challenges. And we have a whole section assessment framework dedicated to that. But I mean, beyond that, again, we don't take a position about claims, preferably for finance to flow. Obviously, a claim should be attractive one that would incentivize use, but for us it's important that whatever credits are used, whatever they're used for, they're of high quality and they represent real measures to verify emission reductions or removals. And some of the court cases that Andre mentioned, right? They were not. I mean, that controversy is usually has two components: what the company is saying and which credits it is using to say those things, right? We're trying to only solve half of the problem and let more competent people solve the other side of it.
Okay. I'm conscious that we've been just talking amongst ourselves for a long time, and I'd love to get input and questions from the audience here.
Thank you very much for a very comprehensive discussion about physics. And my question, two questions, about methodologies. First of all, about 6.4, because so far we don't have any dedicated methodology guidance. 6.4, but in your presentation you mentioned about only 4 CDR projects are durable. So who will judge on what experience is durable CDR project? And about the second question is about kind of the proliferation of the guidance between 6.2 and 6.4. Because now the Norway government and Swiss government made an agreement about CDL. That means it is based on their own kind of methodology. And because 6.2 has a scheme which risks of proliferation of methodologies, because all is done by each government. And thinking on the project side, the proliferation of kind of guideline and principle by donor countries are really burdensome. And definitely we need a kind of integration of methodologies within the 6.2. And then, what happens to 6.4 guidance? Because if governments, particularly donor countries side, are waiting for the guidance produced by 6.4, that's fine. But if they do not wait for that, and they just there's a progress to the conclusion of the agreement, MOU, between these independent countries, we are facing a plethora of methodologies. So how that kind of situation could be avoided? So I'd like to know the exact status on that kind of risk of well-known methodologies.
Right, who wants to take that one? Inji.
Yeah, I can start. I think, yeah, so great question. Just to get off the bat, last year at COP29 there was methodology guidance that was approved by the SBM. So that set the broad framework for what kinds of things are going to be important as part of the review process that they do. In terms of those 4 biochar projects I mentioned, so again, these haven't been passed any kind of scrutiny. You don't need any road test to register over time, and particularly to see a greater diversification in the types of projects we see in that pipeline. What I think could be a real 6.2 and 6.4 is to come with a unified methodology per pathway that you can, under 6.2 in reflection, and that also meets the standards for 4, but a common standard. I agree we can't around I think it would make sense for the industry to that.
Yeah, sure, I'd be happy to add. I mean, it's a very important question about the variety of methodologies, right? In the independent, that's how it is, the biochar methodology. For this program, biochar methodology, that program, trying to at least common under. There are thought to, for lack of a better word, homogenizing elements, right? There is guidance when they related to and the based permanence, and some other elements.